Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Cassie Jo Stoddart? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case. I'll move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Cassie Jo Stoddart was born in Idaho on December 21, 1989. She lived in Bannock County. In the fall of 2006, she was a junior at Pocatello High School, as was her boyfriend, Matt Beckham. In that same junior class, she had two other friends who are relevant to this case, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. Brian and Tori maintained an interest in movies, but otherwise really went unnoticed in the school. Nobody viewed them necessarily as troublemakers. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. Cassie agreed to stay at the house of her aunt and uncle for a couple of days, starting on September 22, 2006. The house was located on Whispering Cliffs Drive, right off Interstate 5. Her aunt and uncle had paid her to care for their 2 dogs and 3 cats when they were out of town for the weekend. Cassie was dropped off at the house sometime around 5:30 p.m. Her boyfriend Matt arrived at the house at about 6 p.m. to spend some time with her. Brian and Tori came by the house at about 6:30 to 7 p.m. Cassie gave her classmates a tour of the house, including the basement. After this, the 4 teenagers watched the movie Kill Bill Volume 2 on a television in the living room. Before the movie ended, Brian and Tori decided to leave the house, claiming that they would prefer to watch a film in a movie theater. They departed at about 9:30 p.m. Prior to leaving, Brian unlocked the door in the basement to facilitate entry into the house later. After Brian and Tori left, Cassie and Matt continued to watch the movie. Brian and Tori returned to the neighborhood about 15 minutes later. They parked their vehicle a short distance from the house, exited the vehicle. They put on gloves, dark clothing, and masks, which were painted white and red. This appears to be inspired by the white mask worn by the character Ghostface from the movie Scream. The teenagers walked to the house and entered through the unlocked basement door. Again, Brian had unlocked it earlier. At this time, Cassie and Matt were still in the living room watching television. Brian and Tori tried to lure Cassie and Matt to the basement by making noises, but nothing happened. Cassie and Matt did not move. They then accessed the circuit breaker box and turned the electricity off. They thought that certainly Cassie and Matt would walk down to the basement to check on the circuit breaker box. But again, the burglars were unsuccessful, so they turned some of the electricity back on. I think they overestimated the knowledge of residential electricity that their victims had. It's not clear that Cassie and Matt knew what a circuit breaker box was. They may not have understood the concept, so when the electricity went off, they didn't really know what to do. Even though Cassie and Matt did not venture to the basement, they were aware that something was wrong. Matt noticed that one of the dogs was staring down the basement steps and occasionally growling and barking. Cassie was feeling anxious due to the temporary loss of electricity. Matt called his mother and asked if he could spend the night at the house in order to comfort Cassie, but Matt's mother said no. As an alternative, his mother offered to let Cassie come home with Matt and stay there for the night. This plan, of course, did not take into account the fact that Cassie was supposed to take care of the dogs and cats. Cassie decided not to leave the house. She did not want to abandon her responsibilities. Matt's mother picked him up at about 11 p.m. Now Cassie believed she was alone in the house. After leaving, Matt called Tori, thinking that maybe they could meet later in the evening. Matt noticed that Tori was whispering on the phone. He thought that Tori and Brian might be in a movie theater. Brian and Tori, of course, were still in the house with Cassie. They could hear that Matt had left the house, and they decided to make their move. They once again turned off the electricity to the house, but Cassie did not go downstairs. After a while, Brian and Tori walked up the stairs. They noticed that Cassie was asleep on the couch. They opened the closet door at the top of the steps and slammed it in order to frighten Cassie. They then attacked her with a hunting knife and a knife that was described as dagger-like. The pair stabbed Cassie about 30 times, killing her. Brian and Tori exited the house and returned to their vehicle. They drove to Black Rock Canyon, which was about a half-hour away, right off of Interstate 5, just like the house. At this location, they disposed of a number of items, including knives, gloves, masks, clothing, and a videotape on which they recorded their plans to commit the murder and talked about the murder after they committed it. On September 24, Cassie's 13-year-old cousin discovered her body. At first, the police didn't really have any idea who committed the crime. They noticed that nothing was missing from the house. They found out from Matt that Brian and Tori had been there. The police conducted interviews, and Brian eventually led them to the hidden items at Black Rock Canyon, including the videotape. On September 27, 2006, Brian and Tori were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. On April 17, 2007, Brian was convicted. Tori was convicted on June 8 of that same year. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder and 30 years for conspiracy. Both men filed appeals. Brian was able to get the conspiracy charge overturned due to improper jury instructions. The good news for him is that he no longer has to serve those 30 years. The bad news is he still has to complete a life sentence. Now moving to my analysis. There's really no question that Brian and Tori were guilty. The videotape removed any doubt. It contained a series of short recordings that were made on September 21 and September 22. The teenagers were recording themselves talking about the murder. These recordings give some insight into the minds of Brian and Tori. Here are a few paraphrased items from the recordings. Brian said that he felt like he wanted to kill somebody. Tori said he needed to break away from normal life. Tori implied that people are taught that murder is wrong, but the only thing wrong with it is that it's a violation of the law. Brian mentioned natural selection in order to bolster Tori's point. Tori went on to say that there should be no law against killing people. Brian talked about how Cassie was going to be alone in a dark house in the middle of nowhere. He believed this was perfect. Tori mentioned how this made him excited sexually. A few times during the recordings, Brian referenced a plan to kill more people and talked about how he and Tori had failed during prior attempts, like they showed up to a victim's house, but the victim was not home alone, so they did not follow through with the attack. At times, the teenagers had what they considered to be philosophical discussions about God, Satan, and the nature of evil. They appeared to agree that they were either bad or evil. The word psychopath was mentioned as well. They compared themselves to Ted Bundy, the Hillside Strangler, and the Zodiac Killer, saying that those serial killers were amateurs compared to what they would become. Tori addressed future serial killers who would be watching this tape as if he believed that the future would bring about serial killer training classes, and their video would be part of the curriculum. On the recording made after the murders, Brian said he just killed Cassie. He stabbed her and saw her lifeless body. It felt like it wasn't even real. I guess he was worried that at his trial there would be some reasonable doubt, so he took care of that. The recording ends just after Tori tells him they need to get their act straight. It's curious that Brian and Tori attempted to kill so many times before, but abandoned the plan after realizing their potential victim was not alone. They actually planned to kill Cassie on September 21, but ended up delaying their plans by a day. Escaping responsibility was a major part of their plan. Again, Tori mentioned it toward the end of their last video recording. Even with this focus on avoiding arrest, they made a few critical mistakes. They talked to the police and eventually implicated themselves, and they fabricated an alibi that involved seeing a movie, but they never actually watched the movie at any time. They couldn't tell the police what happened in the movie. In addition, they were well known by the employees at the movie theater. One teenager who worked there said that she recognized them and that they were not there on September 22. It's frightening to think that if these two killers never talked to the police at all, it's likely they would have never been arrested. There was no other evidence connecting them to the murders other than the fact that they were there visiting that night at the house, and the items that they hid. Of course, the police didn't have access to those without Brian telling them. As far as their personalities, Brian and Tori appeared to have a few different characteristics: a lack of empathy, arrogance, a sense of entitlement, grandiosity, impulsivity, and a disregard for the value of human life. These two genuinely wanted to scare Cassie before killing her. It wasn't just about homicide, it was about fear. I think there was probably some type of sexual component as well, as Tori specifically mentioned, but at least some of their motive was really about the thrill of frightening someone and killing them. They appeared to have psychopathic, narcissistic, and sadistic characteristics. Surprisingly, they managed to disguise these characteristics well, for the most part. They flew under the radar as far as friends, neighbors, family members, or people at school recognizing any type of problem. Nobody suspected that these two could commit murder. Even the police initially thought they probably didn't do it. Early in the investigation, the police were looking more closely at Matt. They said he lacked emotion. Luckily for Matt, the police realized that his story did not change, and the police eventually moved on to looking at Brian and Tori. It was not difficult for the police to manipulate Brian into confessing. He was crying after arriving for a so-called lie detector test. Polygraphs are sad, but not in a crying, depressed type of way, rather in a pseudoscientific way. The last item I want to talk about is the power of a conspiracy. It seems unlikely that either Brian or Tori would have acted alone. It was their friendship with each other that facilitated the conversion of their fantasies into reality. Both of them treated horror movies like career advice. They were both inspired to create human suffering. In cases like this, one offender will be motivated by the other, like they will go back and forth, encouraging each other toward the most reckless behavior. They inspire each other to give in to their most destructive desires. This dynamic makes bad ideas seem glamorous. Essentially, they were able to validate their desire to behave in an antisocial manner. They had a mutual rationalization party. The fact that another person had the same preferences made them feel supported. They were able to push thoughts of consequences into the background. I find it interesting that in one of their recordings, Brian was talking about how they were going to go down in history and be like the movie Scream, except in real-life terms. In the end, they didn't go down in history, but they did get real-life terms. So I guess they did achieve part of their goal. Those are my thoughts in the case of Cassie Jo Stoddart. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.